Awesome. I'm super excited. We'll probably have more people trickle in over time. There's Ian Wong, and I know there's other people that could only come the last half, the first half, but also I think the power of this YAIG infrastructure group we've been working on is it's pretty close and tight knit. So we have some more in-depth conversations. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we'll keep it small. I think I'm going to ask a couple plan here is ask a couple very basic newbie questions, and then for us to have a conversation. And I think at that point anyone can come in and, as I said, a roundtable, more of a conversation than it is an actual Q&A panel thing. So yeah, I'm gonna pass it to Zach Butcher. If you could introduce us, Zach. Who are you? Yep. Tell us everything about us. What's your favorite thing about Zero Trust? Don't answer that question. That's for later.
Hey y'all. So I'm one of the founding engineers here at Tetrate. Before then, I was one of the original engineers on Istio at Google, and before then, I worked on a bunch of the kind of central resource hierarchy and identity and access management system there at Google. One of the big hats that I wear now, and one of the reasons I'm here, is that I work actively with NIST on standardizing stuff in this space. Specifically, I help co-author the federal government standards for microservice security. And so we're seeing those adopted by the FFIEC for the banking industry. We're seeing that adopted by CISA on behalf of the entire federal government. So we're seeing, maybe for the first time in a long time, the government standards are actually kind of apace with technological development, and hopefully we're actually providing some real value for folks on the infrastructure they're trying to build today. And then of course, at Tetrate, we help sell kind of service meshy related stuff to enterprise. So kind of helping solve enterprise adoption and management of service mesh.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Mike, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, I'm Mike Malone, founder, CEO at Small Step. My background, I'm a distributed systems nerd. So like to build large software systems and build teams that build large software systems. And at Small Step, we're an open core startup, and we do internal public key infrastructure and certificate management. So very sort of relevant to the Zero Trust space. Our focus is on infrastructure that works for certificate management at scale for DevOpsy, cloud native folks. We end up selling into lots of other use cases as well, with PKI being a very sort of horizontal problem. But that's our particular area of expertise. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mike. And Sunil.
Hey, everybody. I'm Sunil. Good to see Mike. Good to see Zach. So I was the founder and CEO of a company called Sidetail that started up back in 2020. And we were one of the companies that was trying to breathe life into Spiffy Inspire back in the day. The moment I knew we made it is when I got an email from Louis Orion who said, "Hey, we're putting out this thing called Istio. Can you give me a paragraph on Spiffy?" And I was like, "Dude, I don't even have a company yet. I don't know what you're talking about here." And so for me and for all of us and this broader community that we now have, that's now a graduated project in CNCF, it's been, a great journey over the last number of years to be able to see these ideas that have long existed inside of big companies like Google find their way out into enterprise with plenty of challenges, plenty of issues left and right. Part of it is cultural, part of it is just technological evolution, but it's been an amazing journey. So now we sold the company in 2020 to HPE. We built great tech. We didn't build a great business. And now what we're doing is we are rolling this thing out across HPE entirely. We're going to be working with some stuff in Zach's camp, I'm sure. And so looking forward to bring more of that value to our customers, starting with our own platform. Our group continues to be involved in Spiffy Inspire. We have maintainers in the project, and we continue to be active voices in the future of that. So good to meet you.
Wow. Amazing. Thanks so much. So just to repeat for those who've joined, if you have questions, you want to jump in the conversation at any point. This is meant to be a convo, less of a Q&A. But I'm going to get started. I think a lot of vendors today talk a lot about zero trust. The word has become almost has no definition. So I thought one of the things we could do, one of the things I thought was really interesting, is a lot of like the zero trust started about like layer 7 authorization. So I would love to get all of yours perspective and just the groups, and maybe this is ultimately what we're actually talking about today. What in the world is zero trust? Like, what do we mean, and how has it been butchered, and what is not, right? I think it's a lot of architecture out there. I'm going to pass this one to Zach, but I'm sure all of you have like opinions, so I'd love to hear it.
Yeah. So I'll start because this is, I think, super interesting. So when I talk about zero trust with folks, I usually say that, in my mind, the minimum definition, 5 things need to happen on every single hop and every request, right? So again, just like taking a step back philosophically, the idea that motivates zero trust is that the attacker's already in the network. Something is already compromised. Therefore, my perimeter-based security model is not effective. So in a world where something is compromised, how do I limit the access in time and space that an attacker has on my system, right? So fundamentally, that's what we want to do. I would argue that to do that at runtime effectively, there's 5 things at a minimum that need to happen on every single request, every single hop in your infrastructure. So one, it needs to be encrypted, right? Or at least we need message authenticity, we need replay protection, we need a bunch of the stuff that TLS provides out of the box. So encryption in transit in some way. We need to authenticate and authorize the workload to workload communication. So what are the physical things that are communicating? And then we want to authenticate and authorize the end user to resource access, right? And so if we're doing that at every step, at every hop in our infrastructure, we're a long way there. I would argue, maybe we can argue there's some other things that you need to add, things like payload inspection and validation and XSS protections and IDP systems. And there's a ton of other stuff that sits around that periphery that you want to feed. But I would argue if you're doing those 5 things, then you're a long way towards kind of realizing a zero trust system.
Awesome. Anyone want to jump in? Who's next?
I'll give you my 2 cents.
Go for it.
It's hard to disagree with what Zach said. The only thing I would add to it is, like, at least one of the things that I talk about is, I think what you alluded to, Zach, at the beginning, I presume, and I think our customers presume, that there is no concept of implicit trust anywhere. Just because I am who I say I am, or because I have some access, or I'm on some network sub now, or have you, none of that conveys any entitlements, or it should, right? So there is some modicum of interrogation and validation of whatever the entity is that wants to access some resource. You can argue what level of detail, what is the mechanism of interrogation and attestation, but that's, I think, another tenet that I think is pretty core to at least our internal definition, as well as how we espouse this to our customers too.
Amazing. Mike, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that, or Zach. Yeah.
No, I mean, I think that's a great definition. And in fact, like, Zach, your sort of 5-point criteria is surprisingly similar to what I've said sort of privately in the past, which is funny, because I think both of us sort of came to that independently, it seems.
Yeah.
But yeah, like, point to point, and then end user authentication, obviously encryption and authorization as well. So, like, yeah, it was a great definition. I'd say the only thing that comes to mind to sort of add to a definition is, like, I've thought a little bit about, like, why, like, the phrase zero trust is dumb,
100%.
like overloaded, and is a misnomer, because obviously, like, there is no, like, you're trusting something, right?
Exactly.
So, but the way I've sort of elaborated on, why it's called that is sort of differentiating between, well, trust is a binary relationship, like, X trusts Y. And I think in this case, it's about your system not trusting the network and the network primitives. It's about moving away from the IP address and MAC address based controls towards cryptographic controls.
Exactly.
You still are trusting something. You're trusting your PKI, you're trusting the cryptography and the math, but there's a much smaller surface area to that.
Yeah, I actually had a campaign with some of the folks at NIST and somewhere to try and rename Zero Trust.
Yeah.
Because you're exactly right. It's like, hey, if anything, it should be trustful, right? Because like we're removing this implicit trust and we're making it explicit.
Yeah.
The other thing I'll say, I think Sunil, you're exactly right. Like a lot of what you talked about is what's Spire and Spiffy solved beautifully, is this idea of how do I issue that identity? How do I get that thing that I authenticate? And one of the things I think you hinted at, you talked about the attestation and this idea that when I give something an identity, it's not enough to just have like an application has an identity, but we want to know like what is the environment in which this application executes and where did this application come from? And we want to be able to issue an identity based on both of those, right?
Yeah. I mean, Spiffy is one example, right? But
Yeah.
I mean, if I don't want to use Spiffy and I've got Kubernetes and I use that as my authoritative entity that's going to provide me with provenance of a pod or a workload, that's fine too, right? So whatever it is, right, that is more than just some embedded concept that came preloaded is my point, right? Is that I think is a part of the definition here. And the identity to me is mostly an artifact that comes out of that process, which can be used for all kinds of cool things. It's just a vehicle to enable MTLS or all the other cool stuff that happens with Istio and beyond. So.
Yeah, 100%. And that's like, I think another thing people don't separate out is that idea of like identity and MTLS, because of Istio's like marketing, if you will, go hand in hand, where, we can just as easily do a scheme that's unencrypted in the data center with JOTs, for example, or Google does macaroons LOAS, right? And as long as you have something to do message authenticity, you may not need encryption in transit in your particular system, but you still need an authenticatable identity, and you need to be able to authenticate that the payload wasn't tampered with.
Awesome. Just a reminder, if you have questions, chat it up. But I wanted to go I think this is a great definition of what Zero Trust is. I would like to also talk about what it absolutely is not, before we dive more into sort of the details. Because as I said, I think Zero Trust really came a lot. My understanding of Zero Trust came from some original Google papers that came out. But what is not Zero Trust? What are we seeing it from a vendor? We don't need to name vendors, but you can name vendors if you want. But what are we seeing in the market that is clearly this thing is not a Zero Trust system. It's mismarketing. It doesn't meet these sort of definitions. Are there any things that come to your mind? Sunil, I'm going to start with you. Yeah.
I mean, that's a dangerous question for a
super
vendor.
dangerous question. It is,
answer.
Yes. Do note, I did say you don't have to name names, but you can definitely scoot around as much as you can.
I mean, the get out of jail free answer is the opposite of what we just said, right? No, I mean, it's there's some big security vendors out there that in the last 24 months I've seen Zero Trust marketing come all over the place, and I get into these customer meetings, these advisor meetings where we've got these customers and we start talking about some of the Zero Trust concepts and the way we talk about it here on this call. And they will come back to me and say, well, vendor X, Y, and Z has got this product that says it causes a Zero Trust product. And I think that the realization is that maybe there isn't as widely disseminated, collectively agreed upon definition of that term, to your point. Or maybe there is and vendors don't give a shit and they'll just use what they want to use to sell more product, which is, I guess fine for them too. But that's the realization that I had, is that we still have to work through a lot of FUD. And I think the work Zach you're doing with the government in particular, I mean, I know internal to us, our security, not our ProdSec team, but our CorpSec team at the company, often will use those regs and the language in those regs to articulate and create the boundaries of what it is that we're going to define as being Zero Trust or not. So I think the work that's happening there, at least for a company like ours, which is a large Fortune 500 company itself, actually is quite powerful in terms of our guiding principles about tooling, technology choices, partnerships, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I mean, I would say I'll hop in there. First off, that's awesome. I'm glad to hear that stuff like that is actually being useful. So I think there's like a bunch of kind of broad categories of vendors that talk about zero trust that aren't, right? So I think, exactly like someone, you're not doing like those 5 things, then I think you really can't claim to be zero trust. So, one of the categories is folks that are doing things like device identity and end user identity. That is a hugely important and really challenging part of the total zero trust problem, right? But that alone, having just things like device identity is not sufficient, right? There's other categories of vendors that are selling fundamentally encryption in transit solutions, right? And again, those can maybe get me 2 or 3 of those 5 that I listed, but it's not going to get you anything in the end user side of it, right? If we're doing a network oriented approach for encryption and similar, right? So they fail on some of those marks, and I think fundamentally we see that for all of the vendors in the space. So we deal with a bunch of this FUD, like when I go in and talk and encryption and so that's the biggest thing is I see folks that equate encryption in transit and enabling internal encryption. When I say internal, I mean on east-west traffic in between, what used inside my traditional perimeter boundary as zero trust, right? And that fundamentally isn't, because it doesn't address the fundamental problem, which is somebody has compromised something in the infrastructure. How do I limit their attack surface in space, lateral movement, and in time, right? How long they have to perpetrate an attack.
Awesome. Mike, I don't know if you had some thoughts there. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll agree with Zach and Sunil that like that's a hard question to answer, and I think part of it is like nothing is zero trust. I'd say like, no product. If a vendor is selling you a product that does zero trust, it's probably BS. Zero trust is an architectural philosophy, not a product, not a solution. And just to add some drama to the conversation, I'll maybe slightly disagree with what Zach said, because I'd say like there's an argument to be made that like device identity, sort of that bottom turtle is an important component to a zero trust architecture. Like Apple just announced their implementation of the Acme device attestation spec and branded device attestation, and they're calling that a zero trust solution. And I think that's fair because it's replacing SCEP, which is definitely not a zero trust solution and is kind of a tire fire and doesn't have very good security characteristics. So I think it is fair for Apple to claim that this is a new capability that enables and aligns with a zero trust philosophy.
100%.
It's not the end, though. It is not like you don't just start using that and then say you're doing zero trust. That's not how it works.
Exactly. And that's what I mean to say. So like that device identity and stuff like that is a huge enabler, because fundamentally we need everything's based on the identity. If we don't have the identity, then none of this matters, because you don't even know who you're communicating with. So fundamentally, it's hugely important, but exactly like you said, having it doesn't make you zero trust.
Right.
Having it is a necessary prerequisite to build a zero trust system on top of that. Right. And the other thing, I think, you took the words out of my mouth. It's an architecture, it's a philosophy, it's a mindset. It's not a checkbox, right? So you can't just have a product that's zero trust, because you need to change your organizational thinking, your organizational process, and what your security model is to benefit from zero trust.
That's great. I think this is like a great lead in, because one of the key questions we had people like people fill like a form. One of the key questions was, and this is a great group to ask this question, like in watching people try to adopt zero trust, what are like the primary roadblock? What are the things that they get in front of? Like what are the stumbling blocks in adopting? I think, and also that would be different for many different organizations, but I think the three of you have spent an inordinate amount of time trying to get people to adopt this new philosophy, this new posture, a new way of thinking about authorization and thinking about access control. I'd love to. I'm going to pass this one to you, Mike, because I haven't passed you one yet. But
yeah, I think it's not one thing. It's the scope of the problem. It's all of the things. It's death by 1,000 cuts is the issue, right? You, especially for large organizations that have, you know, a long operating history, you're talking about, you know, is it any major architectural change, you know, from monolith to microservices, from relational to non-relational databases. Like, it's hard to even just comprehend the scope of the work that needs to get done, let alone do it. So it's a journey. I think that's sort of what I preach is just start and you know, attack it sort of incrementally. I'm sure Zach and Sunil have stuff to add to this. I think you know, things like Istio are a pretty big hammer that can get you a lot of the way there really quickly, which is one of the, you know, major attractions to it. Yeah.
Sunil, I saw you on mute, so yeah.
Yeah. God, this is like years of my life.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out how to
Hopefully good years, and they're not like having like
Yeah.
terrible flashbacks. Yeah.
No. They were they were great years, but it was like hitting your head against the wall, right? And then I realized a couple of things. I realized that, like, I mean, I know the adage has existed for a long time, but like, I think a lot of times, like, you forget about the fact that people don't often have the time or the purview to step back and roll in their organization and think comprehensively and holistically. And if you find those people in the organization, they might be sitting in a box somewhere off to the side that's drawing pretty pictures and diagrams and not really connected with what the business is actually going through. So there's a complete disconnect. I think I had that happen to me like 5 times, 5 different companies, major, like Fortune 50 brands, fantastic pie in the sky whiteboarding. And then when it came down to it, we're like, okay, so let's talk about getting this thing moving. What's step 0? What does that look like? Like, well, I don't know. Do you have a competitor to HashiCorp Vault? I'm like, well, no. Is that what we were just talking about for the last 5 weeks? So I think there's a little bit of that we face with organizations, is that the idea of figuring out and having connected strategy architecture group towards, you know, figuring out how to implement this, I think is important to do. And I also think part of the issue is that language matters here quite a bit. Like for our experience, I used to use this in my pitch decks, like we sit in between the seams of like 3 different functional areas of a business that have 3 different reporting structures, all to the CEO perhaps, right? And so, like, you know, it's difficult if it's difficult for us to navigate who to talk to as a vendor, right? I can only imagine for a company, an individual engineer, a platform engineer, whatever it might be, to corral across those 3 domains. I think there's like an evolution of organizations towards recognizing that patterns like zero trust, you know, have to be considered across multiple domains, but, you know, we have to have the ability to make decisions in a more efficient manner than what it had been for us when we started back in 2017. So,
yeah. No, I think those are exactly right. So I think there's the organizational challenges that I think, you know, Sunil and Mike talked about really well. There's kind of the educational challenges that they also alluded to, right? So it's not well understood what it is. It's not well understood what it takes to achieve it. Therefore, there's a lot of you know, and then that's compounded by the fact that there's a lot of essential complexity in this space, right? So we can talk about, you know, essential complexity and incidental complexity, right? So the stuff that's the complexity because it's just hard versus the complexity that we inflict on ourselves. And there's a lot of essential complexity in PKI, in certs, and so even just talking about them is confusing. And then exactly, I think that language problem and the fact that there's not a common language across those groups and to lay out the groups that we see sitting across, you know, it's the security team, it's a new platform team that's charged with the cloud migration, it's the networking traffic teams that have existed and the app teams together. And they don't talk about and they don't think about the world in the same way. Therefore, it's hard to push an initiative across all these groups. So that's the one side of it that we see. And I think, Sunil and Mike talked about that very well. Tactically, then, like, how do you actually get started? So I think that's exactly right. Mike just said, hey, the key is to get started. So like, how do you actually get started? I think there's like two ways to think about it. So one, at a high level as an organization, you need to, just identify, you need to identify an inventory. You need to establish plans around that inventory. You need to establish patterns for detecting problems and identifying when things are changing in that inventory. You need to develop patterns, practices, and capabilities to respond and recover, right? And that's just a basic framework for responding to any kind of a security incident, any kind of a security system, right? Inventory, protect, detect, respond, recover. This is stuff that even this talks about, but it's a useful framework for like orienting ourselves. Then as far as what specific thing after we've like identified what exists in the universe, where we want to start to apply protections, then what we see the big challenge then being is that policy enforcement point. And obviously I'm coming at it from the mesh perspective, and so that's why that biases my response here, because the mesh is that policy enforcement point. So for us, that's where we see that effective next step being. I'm curious, what Sunil and Mike kind of think about this, given coming from the identity side. I totally agree. Identity is like the fundamental most important thing, but the challenge with identity is like something has to plug in to use it and drive it. And so that's why I see the policy enforcement point, the sidecar and the mesh brings, which can leverage the identity, which can implement a bunch of these policies, as being a really effective starting point to get leverage in the organization to start to enact some of those zero trust policies, some of that zero trust, to start to build that zero trust architecture.
I mean, within even within HPE, right? Like we started I don't know how we fell into the same trap over and over again. We did, but we got into this pedestal. We started talking about like identity, and then we realized that like we're totally missing the mark with the people who are like just trying to build a platform, right? So instead we're like, well, maybe we should focus on encrypting all of our traffic, or east-west traffic in our data center. Yeah, that sounds great. Let's go do that. Okay, cool.
Yeah, suddenly have money for that. Like I have money to allocate for that because I have an MRA, like a matter requiring attention, or some other motivator to do that, right? Whereas I don't have money for identity, even though it sounds awesome.
It's a component of it, right? Is what it comes down to. And so it's just language that we had to just kind of change how we framed it. So and in that example, like I don't talk about Istio or a mesh, or I don't talk about Spire. We just talk about, well, what would that look like? And what are the requirements for that? And then we back our way into, an architecture with components that could potentially serve that. So yeah.
Mike, I see you nodding along. I don't know.
Oh yeah. Oh, I mean, lots of thoughts here. The language definitely matters, and connecting to the business value definitely matters. I mean, going back to the Acme device attestation stuff, it's funny, Apple calls it zero trust, but also if you talk to customers and people in the ecosystem, the way it's being sold is the primary value is zero touch deploy of new devices, which ties directly to a business value around, reduced workforce and more efficient workflow around deploying, and often these are like managed devices, not necessarily laptops, say like Apple TVs running kiosks at a mall and stuff like that, right? The ability to deploy that without having a person, an IT help desk person involved, has a dollar value that like an IT org understands. So, to move a large enterprise, I think you need to connect it to enterprise value, and that's fair and makes sense. On the sort of authorization side of things, I mean, Ian, my backstory here, like Small Step actually started with an authorization product and some technology that, we continue to be really excited about, frankly, and did a lot of development around sort of policy enforcement, policy capture. We wrote a whole programming language that had sort of characteristics that made it sort of amenable to that problem space from code mobility and confinement and termination characteristics and stuff like that. And then we started bringing it to market, and I think we found two things. Like, one was it broke people's brains. The unit of value is too big, right? It's like, boil the ocean and then you get this value, and you have to install it everywhere, and that was just a lot to stomach. And the other was the sort of more immediate problem was, at the time, and I think it still is not completely solved, surprisingly, years later, is our customer said, cool authorization product, but I don't have authentication yet. And without authentication, I can't do authorization. So go solve authentication and then come back to me when that's solved. And here we are.
Amazing. One of the, something like an interesting question here is like what are some companies that have actually done this successfully, like have actually adopted like a zero trust? Are there any ones that stand out in anyone's minds in terms of like actually had the complete journey? I think there's like the Beyond Corp and Beyond Prod stuff from Google, the ones that come to my mind, but I'm curious if there's outside of like the Google of the world, are there any well-known companies or companies that you know of that you can speak about openly, right? That have actually gotten far along this journey? Like, where do you think most people are today? And is there like, a hallmark of like this, they've done it really well, or this went incredibly well in terms of like their implementation or the way they approached it? Zach, you're nodding along, so I'm gonna pick up the cue.
So maybe maybe that you guys will correct me here, but I am not sure that it's easy to point to a single example of somebody that's like done it end to end. That's like, oh wow, that's the one to go replicate, right? I think there's a lot of companies that have done different parts of it well, right? I do think Google is a good example to point to of, hey, they have realized a system similar to this. I think that there are quite a few other kind of large tech companies that have similar capabilities that are not, maybe that they don't talk about it as much, right? But fundamentally have a very similar security posture and a security model to that. I think that actually gets to maybe some of the challenge around the what does it mean and all the FUD today, is that there's not like a very clear, this is the one you should go implement these people, other than kind of the pie in the sky, hey, go be Google, right? And most people say, well, go F off, right? Like because it's not very helpful. So I don't know. I mean, I would love, hopefully, Mike and Sunil have some counter examples or have some good examples to point to, but it seems to me like it's still very early, and most of the people that we are talking to trying to grapple with this problem in industry today are at the phase of like nice architectural drawings and trying to rationalize how this model works with the existing security model and how they can start to do a staged evolution towards that target state. Certainly big financials are in that boat, right? I don't know if any of the big financials are like, we are zero trust, for example.
Yeah, we part of the challenge is that my entry into this world is from the workload side of things. It's not necessarily from the user side, right? So I don't really know as much about organizations that are, I don't know enough about how to speak about organizations doing that side of it. Say what you will about Spiffy Inspire. The thing that I'll point to is that we have folks in the open source community that have spent the last 3 years finding a religion with, ubiquitous workload identity, and then just starting, right, to Mike's point, like figuring out like what's the smallest increment of making support progress, and then layering on top of that all the other components of whatever that zero trust architecture is going to be right for them, right, at that time in the business. So, and not the best example because they just got whacked, but Uber, from the standpoint of rolling out and running a massive infrastructure around identity, deploying cryptographic identities across all of its infrastructure. It's just stupendous. ByteDance was another one. Anthem is another one that have come to this layer of the story from the workload side of things. But they've also started to really help us understand the complexities of manageability, right, at the scale that they operate as well, which I think we all knew was coming, but I don't think we really understood the toolkits, the tool chains that they were wanting to use, and how do we create scale there for them? Like, yeah, we can churn out identities like the best of them, but like how do you manage the policies associated with that relatively efficiently is another area. So those are some that I have some examples of.
Yeah, I mean, in conversations, going back to this being an architecture and a philosophy, I think it's fair to say that if you've embraced the architecture and the philosophy and you've changed your mindset, then you are doing zero trust. And I think there are a lot of organizations that have embraced the architecture and the philosophy and are moving in that direction. Comparing to Google is, I think, very unfair. It's something I've sort of like learned talking to like other large organizations. Google's unique in their commanding control of their IT systems sort of across the entire org. For an org that scale, I think it's unusual to have the sort of homogeneous, very controlled, very carefully thought out architecture that they have. Most orgs are much more sprawling, much more integrations, much more vendor solutions in place. And that's realistically, Google is Google, and no one else has the sort of capabilities and resources internally to just reinvent everything and the margins to afford it and all that stuff. So that's just the real world. And a lot of vendors aren't there yet, right? And like, if you're integrating a vendor that's not there yet, you got to figure out how to do that. Like, you don't always have the luxury, like you do at Google, to say like, well, they're violating one of our zero trust principles. So instead of buying this solution, we're just going to rebuild it from scratch internally so that it conforms. But certainly there are a lot of smart people at a lot of these organizations that are heading in the right direction. There also, you guys see Richard Crowley's on here. He's a buddy of mine, formerly at Slack. And there are companies like Slack that have done really interesting things in this space, like the Nebula sort of mesh network, cryptographic VPN, which you could argue is, I think it's, it'd be a fun thing to argue about, like it being a, not layer 7, right? Is that zero trust? But I think they would say it is. And they've deployed that globally. So maybe that's a good example.
That's a great question. Actually leads to like one of the questions that people were asking in the forum, which is like, we talk a lot, like, I mean, my background comes from like the ops side, right? I'm more distributed system side. That's where I started, like the workload identity problem and like the attestation between workloads and authorization layer between workloads. And it wouldn't be amazing if cryptographic identity. One of the things that comes up, we have the corporate, so more of a corporate infosec, corporate sec side of the equation. But one thing that actually comes up frequently is having conversations with zero trust. A lot of people associate zero trust, at least in the R&D side, with like infrastructure workloads, right, and access to production. But what about the application layer? And so, what about these, things like confidential computing? How do we differentiate between these two layers? And if zero trust is an architecture and a philosophy, is there, does it just apply to how we think about how engineers get access and identity and how their workloads identify inside the infrastructure? Or is there things at the application layer as well that we need to think about as well? Those are some, like, this is a more open-ended question, but I'd love to sort of have that conversation as we think about, if we start talking more about like what the different layers of the stack and how we think about it. So I don't know who wants to tackle that one or has thoughts on it, but very interesting for the future here. Hear crickets. Mike wants to talk though, or Sunil, go for it.
No, I mean, I'm just trying to parse the question a little bit. There's a lot in there to unpack. Like when I think about confidential computing, I think about a model where I've got some 2U server or virtual or physical, whatever. I've got some abstraction layer sitting on top of it, Nutanix, Kubernetes, I don't care. And then I've got a set of workloads that are gonna run on top of that could become components of eventually a monolith, or it is the monolith itself. And on that machine, to your confidential computing case, how do I create strong isolation guarantees, right? In terms of the data that's being ingested, processed, stored, and then transmitted out from that machine so that other tenants on that machine don't have any ability to do that. I think there's, I mean, not to be pithy about this, but like I feel like the concepts that we're talking about, the preconditions here around being able to ensure that that container, that VM is what it says it is, whatever framework you use to attest that, cool, do that. But then there's probably deeper integrations with, you know, the underlying substrate hardware manufacturers and technology providers like that to honor, right, the fact that these identity constructs relegated to a specific workload are somehow passed back down and used to enforce that isolation so that you can say, yeah, this identity associated with this workload, touching these types of data objects on this host, you know, are all within a bounded context for, that's probably the wrong word, but for, you know, processing. So don't allow other things to be able to touch that. Don't allow memory space to necessarily have overlapping access to things of that sort. So it feels like more of a, for me, that your specific example is more of an implementation detail that we just need to go down the rabbit hole of itself.
Yeah, so maybe if let me rephrase the question as, because I think this is what you're getting at, which is how does the application evolve given a zero trust architecture, right?
Thank
so
you.
like what is
Yes.
the net effect? Yeah, so this actually is something that we've thought a little bit about in the context of some like the NIST work and similar, right? And the idea that we want to, so there's a couple different ideas here. So one, obviously, so without a doubt, the application can become simpler because I can export a bunch of these concerns to another layer, right? That's the whole kind of point. That was, especially when the mesh originally came out, there's a lot of questions around like mesh versus serverless, because if you look at the base set of features around like logging, you know, operational capabilities, they're very similar, right? We've seen both be adopted. So that's like, so how does so the application becomes simpler? Let me give you an example. So this, one of the other hats that I wear is doing authorization research. I do research in identity and access management systems with NIST as well, and specifically access control. And you know, the way that we build our own software internally at Tetrate and deliver our software product to customers actually looks fundamentally very different than how most people build that software. And it's because we're leveraging a lot of these zero trust principles. So to give you an example, we have authorization externalized from the application. And in fact, when we do authorization, what I get back from the authorization system is a token that I can use to authenticate that it actually really did come from them, and basically a set of keys. And we go to the data, and you know, for a simple application that's just doing CRUD, you go to the database with the keys, you get the values out of the key, you know, you get the values for the keys, maybe you do a transformation or two on the way out, and then you hand it back to the user. And so literally my CRUD application becomes that simple. It becomes get the, you know, check that we are in a trusted context, that I got the token from the authorization server and that it is valid. Then in that trusted context, just go get the stuff from the database, do my business transformation and send it out, right? And a lot of the concerns that I had around the who can access which pieces and similar, we can push down to the authorization system. And so, you know, these common CRUD services become like, you know, the bodies of these methods to go and implement this business behavior becomes very simple, right? The complexity really gets pushed into what is the transformation that needs to happen to the data for the business use case, right? And that's where you want it to be. That should be that should be where the complexity is for an application developer, because we have all this in a common system. So that's I think the vision, right? Is that because we can offload a bunch of the security concerns to this common layer, my application logic itself should be able to be simpler. And you know, we've seen that firsthand. We've not been able to see other folks maybe benefit from that as much yet, because that requires, like, you know, Mike can probably talk to this too, given the experience that he has with STEP, but like that requires a really sophisticated and high performance authorization system that requires, like, it has a lot of requirements to be able to get there. But in that world, it's a really beautiful place to be. It really is one of the, sorry, and I'll end on this. We had this idea in NIST that the service mesh might be able to become the security kernel for our distributed system. And that's really why a lot of the folks that I work with are very excited, and this especially are very excited about it, is this idea that, just like the operating system kernel becomes the place that we harden, it becomes the place that gets attacked because that's where we put privilege. The service mesh has the opportunity to become a similar thing for a modern distributed system.
Mm-hmm.
And in the same way that a kernel makes user applications simpler because it provides a user space, the idea is that, this kind of a zero trust environment, I won't even just say mesh, but a zero trust environment should make applications simpler because it's providing that kind of kernel, that it's providing that user space for it to sit in.
Very interesting. Yeah, Mike, I don't know, do you have some thoughts here to add? And Zach, that was a great reframing of my question. Thank you.
Do I have thoughts to add? I mean, there are 1,000 directions you could run with here. But yeah, I mein, the separation of authorization from the application, I think, is a really interesting challenge. Authorization is an incredibly challenging problem space. My experience there is like two observations. One, like 99.9% of authorization is incredibly simple. Like an access control list is all that most things need, period. And then the other 0.1% requires like a Turing complete programming language. So it's this weird dichotomy of like, like most things are incredibly simple, except for the things that aren't, that require like a whole bunch of infrastructure and apparatus to solve for. Nevertheless, I think like the approach that Zach's describing has legs and is probably the right approach. Although it's been tried before and hasn't really seen widespread adoption. So I'm watching it with much interest to see how that all shakes out. I think there's a lot of other aspects that, reading between the lines of your question, maybe a little bit, there's a lot of stuff going on in software supply chain and just trusted computing in general that I think is relevant. Like, we could argue whether it's zero trust or something else, but it's definitely relevant to like the everyone sort of up leveling the security story end to end. And that's a good thing. So I embrace all of these efforts, even where maybe I disagree in some of the details. I think there's a lot of good stuff going on.
And do we think that zero trust, sort of like, if we just think about zero trust at the infra access identity authorization layer, do we think those things are the enablers for what some people have been calling like convolutional compute or trusted computing? And some of these newer layers, is this an enabler to the future? Is that how we position it and how we think about it?
I mean, there's no point in doing like without this sort of solutions in place. There's no point in any of the rest, right? Like, and this is one of the problems with some of the, not to keep going back to this, but like the device attestation stuff, like without those fundamentals, then it's really easy for somebody to just dismiss everything on top of it as being also insecure. So again, certainly, I think an enabler at least.
Awesome. Great. I think we're coming to the end. I don't know if anyone has some questions.
One thing I'll just add to that real quick, is that I think actually we mentioned Uber as an example earlier, and Sunil, I think you summarized this beautifully. One of the things that we are seeing as people go down that zero trust architecture, and we focus this idea of the security kernel, and we're focusing kind of the pain on the new, is that we're seeing it break in new and interesting ways because these new kind of load-bearing components, right? So we saw, for example, that maybe in Uber's case, was the fact that credentials, end user credentials were able to be owned, right? And it doesn't matter how good your policy is after that. If I have valid end user credentials to be able to access the thing, then I can access the thing, and no policy. We can talk about risk-based authentication and things like that to mitigate access. But those are all. But fundamentally, the key is that as we're hardening the system, we're going to shift where attackers focus. And so we're going to start to see a new kind of spate of attacks and all in this space, in that style, because we don't know how to manage those at scale yet, because we don't. And so I would expect that we're going to continue to see, especially credential-based attacks against more, especially against advanced tech. We're going to start to see new parts of the system start to break as we shift around which parts are load bearing for the security perspective.
Can I just break in with it? And I apologize, I came in late, so this might have been asked, but I'm listening to this, and the zero trust, the problem is it's this hairball of which we can attach a whole bunch of things to it, and it's holistic, and holistic sales are a disaster because at hearing elements of that in practical real world terms, what actually ends up actually selling either to lead the spear or the only damn thing you ever implement because the rest of the holistic thing never actually gets implemented. I'm just trying to kind of get it to what, because you could sit here and say zero trust and it becomes this theory, and I can hear that frustration in your discussions. What actually works practically out there? Does that make sense as a question?
Who wants to take it? Sunil's going for it. Go for it.
Yeah. I think your question is, what products are people actually buying that open up the door for this to be a conversation?
Yeah, except for VPN, which is the one thing, okay, we can all admit we need a better VPN. Like that one is clear, but the rest of it, zero trust, it very quickly goes into this sort of haze of, frankly, acronyms. What actually makes the sale or turns this from a hypothetical to a real discussion where dollars start flowing? And just your experience of it is what I'm really just asking for.
Yeah, so I can start, and I think, Sunil, you said the same thing earlier, but I can say for me, for the service mesh, the first thing on the ground that gets value for people that they put dollars down for is the encryption in transit with identity.
Yeah.
And that's the first step that you get, right? Now, a lot of people conflate that to be zero trust is encryption in transit. We talked about that at the beginning. Obviously, that's not correct, right? But that's the first incremental step, because that gets us two of the five things that I laid out at the beginning of the unit. Encryption, and it gets you workload identity if you're doing it right and not doing a VPN, but doing Spiffy Spire or similar, those kinds of more sophisticated identity systems.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. I mean, I think the language, especially language in regs that talks about or mandating encryption for traffic between infrastructure. Like I think I saw in the executive order, I think
it is required. I can tell you right now, it's in 853. It's in the executive order mandate. So like encryption in transit everywhere is needed for the federal government.
So as that gets regurgitated and torn apart to figure out, okay, does my product help you meet that reg coming down if you want to continue to do business with USG? Those products will, I think, naturally become interesting and open up the aperture for the broader architectural conversation that we're talking about here. That's what I can represent. I don't know much from the user side if there's as much of a single entity or single thing that's driving the conversation in a more material way. But that's what I see in their workload side.
I think like the compliance bullet point is, I think there's like a generalization of that. Maybe so an observation here is that like traditionally a lot of security products are sold by FUD, right? And they're sold, the motion is to like point to like an incident. And one issue with zero trust philosophy is generally this isn't how people get in, right? Or it's not preventing people from getting in, not necessarily. It's a lot of defense in depth thing. To Zach's point that he's made several times, like a lot of it is mitigating lateral movement and limiting blast radius and stuff like that. So when there's an incident, if there's a security incident, often like people will focus on how an attacker got in and less on the sort of defense in depth stuff. So maybe this doesn't get as much attention and as much money as it deserves because of that. I'll just, an observation that I've made is like, all right, flipping this on its head, like what makes someone buy and how to get more adoption here. Well, why does a CISO get fired? And I think there are two reasons. One is if they get in the way, which I think is part of the adoption for like alternative VPNs, because VPNs suck and they get in the way of people's workflows. So there's a value prop there. The other is if there's a security incident, but not just any security incident, a security incident that shouldn't have happened, that for which they should have known better. And that is things like the NIST stuff and new compliance requirements helps there, because we're laying this foundation of like these are just baseline expectations, and I think that's how the needle will start to move on some of that stuff.
So I have a question, Zach. So am I correctly interpreting your statement as saying that like a large portion of Istio's adoption can be explained directly by the security features of the platform itself? Or
I think that's a big part of it, right? So I do think it's critical to say that if you just came to the, like, if we rolled back in time and we talked to the folks that adopted Istio and we came to them and just said, hey, here's the thing that just says encryption in transit for you, I don't necessarily think the majority of them would have picked up that and then said, great, cool, I'm done. Right. So I think it's the entry point for a lot of folks that are looking at the mesh, because the adoption is kind of large and it's a large and painful process. So I need to find something that is large and painful to pay for it. Therefore, encryption in transit is a thing that is attractive there. The reason I say that encryption alone, like encryption in transit alone, isn't enough is because immediately as I'm sitting there and talking with the group, that you even just talking to the security team who cares deeply about encryption in transit, all of the traffic management things are security features too. So resiliency and circuit breaking and failover, but failover that avoids cascading failures, and all of those things are additionally security features, right? But those are L7 things that you need to be in the traffic path for. So like you start to get this case very quickly that like none of the standalone feature, like all of the standalone features of the mesh are valuable. But when I want to achieve, these kind of hard use cases around, improving my security posture to adopt a zero trust architecture, it's not just like the one piece of it that I need. I need the traffic resiliency to have graceful failover and graceful system degradation from a security perspective. I need the metrics to help close the loop, right? So I need to understand, is policy being enforced at runtime? So I need some way to close the loop on enforcement too. Like, and so it's all of these pieces together that contribute to like why the service mesh is compelling, even if the first place that I'm going to use it to demonstrate business value is enabling encryption in transit.
Yeah, so the reason I ask is because it seems to me, not being a part of the Istio community in any serious fashion, that it's not security engineers who are bringing Istio into like a company. It's usually like probably correct. Infrastructure or network engineers, I'm guessing, who 100%. who are I mean, I guess I would be kind of surprised if they thought of it as like a security product because it's so featureful, right? Like you get all this stuff and it just
that's
happens
actually
to
part
be
of the hard part of the sell.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, expand. I would love to hear more about that.
So that's the challenge. So like Sunil alluded to this earlier when he said that you kind of sit between a bunch of different groups, right? Yeah. So Spire, I know, had and Sitel had this problem sitting between the infrastructure group and the security group. With the service mesh, we have the same problem because I'm sitting between the same, the platform team that we see established, the existing security team, the existing traffic management team, all of the application teams. And you actually have to sit in there between all of them. And so usually what we see is that the mesh purchase is driven by the platform or infrastructure team, but we don't see a successful sell unless we additionally get buy-in from some of these other stakeholders to be advocates. And usually for us at Tetrate, because we have such a security skewed focus, it is the security team that becomes advocates for us. And that's what helps like push us over the edge versus maybe some other mesh vendors that you may pick up, right? So like it becomes, and it gets all the challenges that Sunil talked about. Like there's not a language. So how do you talk to the network team and the app team and the security team and the platform team in the same meeting, right? Like where all four of them are sitting there. And so it becomes this hard challenge of they don't have a common language. The service mesh maybe starts to give us some of that because we can at least start to agree on what a service is and how community, like, So we see this incrementally helping, but fundamentally the challenge in the cell is that there's not like one thing that you point to and go, you don't have this problem tomorrow. Like there are some, encryption in transit's one you can point to and go, we can solve this for a lot of applications tomorrow. But in the context, but it's all of these, it's a kind of this mishmash of different things together that contribute to that cell, that motion of hey, I want that mesh thing.
Cool.
And I think that's inherent. Sorry, just to fill that out. Like I think that's inherent to the design and architecture of the service mesh itself, right? So it's the fact that there is a central central control plane that gives me one policy control point to affect the entire infrastructure. Necessarily, then I'm going to have to deal with a whole bunch of different people who all want to go to that policy point to put in policy into the system. And when I say policy, please don't only hear security. Right, so traffic management and how traffic flows is a policy. Observability and what observability exists in the system and where it goes is a policy. Which traffic can flow where is an authorization decision is a policy too.
So it seems like, well, it just seems like kind of an interesting positioning because I wonder how many security products end up like start off where it's like the value proposition is actually not security, but a greatly enhanced like a pile of features that are actually independently useful or that aren't traditionally sold as security products. My guess is like, not being a security person, my guess is like not that many security products. It seems like most security products that people try to sell me are like, hey, you know that thing you do that's bad? Let's like figure out a way to make that less bad or like cut that out.
We ended up again, getting into language, we ended up getting back to like misdirection, like developer efficiency. And like, we started talking about productivity. We started talking about like, just getting N% more utilization out of your existing engineers so that they don't have to necessarily think about, right? So we started talking about that when we were getting opportunities to have C-level conversations, because the security stuff was like, just kind of going over their head for a lot of those guys. And so that opened up the door for us to actually get down. We still had to fight it out, but getting that top level mind share was definitely not a security story per se at that.
Well, I mean, that completely makes sense because like the CIO, like how does the CIO get fired? CIO gets fired for not moving fast enough, right? Like,
exactly.
Like that's the reason why we're going to Kubernetes in the first place is because in theory it's supposed to increase our shipping velocity. And people forget that that's why you get fired if you fail this transition. And so I think that completely makes sense. But I also think like when Scytale was like, when Scytale was just starting, I worked at Heptio at the time, and it was kind of interesting because it felt like, like 80% of the ecosystem was in the phase where they were like architecting their application. And for a lot of companies, that comes well before the part where you're trying to like really lock down production and make sure you have good policy and stuff like that. And it was just like, when we had those conversations at Heptio, it was just hard to have them because the customers weren't thinking about that. They were thinking about like, literally, how am I going to accomplish my core objective, which is getting into production in less than like a month, right? Like I want to ship more than once a month, right? Like that's what they're thinking about. It's just like they were not thinking about security. Like they were maybe thinking about backups, but nothing like network security.
Totally.
Yeah, I mean, so to your point, we position our product as an agility enabler, right? As hey, migrate to cloud faster, right?
Yeah.
The security case, exactly like Sunil said, we make the security argument to the security organization, and hopefully that's a compelling argument. But the larger position that we take is facilitate modernization and have these best practices as you're moving, right? And I think that's one of the things too that we're seeing is like a lot of people now, it seems like, have that initial footprint in Kubernetes, right? And now it's the game of, okay, now the 80% is coming, right? So like I have my first like 5%. Now I'm bringing, the rest of the fleet. Now security, we better get that right before everybody gets here. Because if everybody's here and security's not figured out, then we're never fixing security. And so that's, I think, another kind of one of the, and then there's the entire, we didn't even talk about the entire like shift left DevSecOps thing and that has maybe more FUD than ZTA. But that whole side of it as well, I think, is motivating caring about that security side in the new environments you're going to earlier. And then that, I think, combined with the executive order, combined with some of the high profile hacks recently and similar, all create an atmosphere that's a lot different than when Heftio was operating in terms of the urgency of the security need today, I think.
Well, I remember when Istio came out, I was at GlueCon. It's like 20, I can't remember if it was 2017 or 2018.
2018.
Yeah.
No, 2017 actually. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. I remember it, and it was kind of funny because like I was there and I was hanging out with the Buoyant guys because
yeah, they're a good crew to hang out with.
And they're hilarious, number one, but
yeah, they're great.
But they're also but it was kind of interesting because it kind of sucked all the air out of the conference. And when people were talking about it, they were not talking about it as a security product. They were talking about it as a capabilities product. So the idea that you had a central place for like networking and routing configuration, so on, like that's how people saw it, at least at the time. And I remember thinking that it's interesting that like people view it as, view this as like, something not a security product. Like
I think even Zero Trust was not. I mean, Istio came out in 2016, 2017. Like Zero Trust didn't come into vogue until 2018, right? Yeah. Even though like obviously those topics have existed. So I think like part of it's the entire ecosystem moving. I think part of it as well is Istio didn't know how to position itself is part of it. And part of this too is I think Istio as a security first thing is maybe a little bit of a brand, that's something that we have intentionally pushed in terms of this idea of Istio as the security kernel and some of those ideas that were not around and we're pushing, back 4 years ago as well, right? So I think all of that kind of contributes to that evolution towards addressing the security case. Because fundamentally, I think there's not a lot of money for just another infrastructure layer. And that's like what Buoyant, I think, has seen, right? But there is money around for a security product.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, it's a sticky challenge, right? And like we started not selling around security and have evolved towards it in the past 4 years, right? Just because we've seen exactly those shifts that I described in the market, right? Things like the executive order coming down for the federal government were a huge boon for us. I mean, aside from the fact that it literally cited stuff that I helped write, like it was a huge boon from the perspective of mandating a bunch of these things that we think are correct to move towards anyway. And we saw the service mesh as being well suited to address, right?
I see Ian trying to wrap it up.
I am, but I think Mike unmuted, so I'm like, maybe he wants to chime in.
Yeah,
so I'm
sorry,
like,
No, it was a great conversation. No,
it was. Yeah. Thank you so much, Sunil, Zach, Mike, and Alex and Steve for your questions. This was fun. The recording will be up on the YouTubes, and I mean, I'm always down to chat about all things Zero Trust. And we've gotten feedback from those who showed up. It was super high value. So thank you so much.
Did we I meant to ask a question. What does Zero Trust mean these days? Did we already cover this?
We did.
Okay, I'll watch the video. Never mind.
Yeah. Amazing.
I knew what it used to mean. I don't quite understand. I saw an email inbox product the other day and it was like